Its elucidation demands a description and an exact analysis of the changes with the structure of the family and the whole relationship of the sexes, and so on. I think I don't have to bring it all here, but this is a central point that since then, if we reflect the figurational family development, since then countless discussions, conferences, and papers dealt with Elias' most popular book on the process of civilization. Nevertheless, this special problem has been left aside for a long time. It took nearly 7 decades to even have a keynote on gender and process theory at a figurational conference. Moreover, in his process book, Elias was convinced of the importance of the gender analysis as an important aspect in process theory. And even although in the great times in Amsterdam from the 1980s onward, well-known Dutch, English, and German colleagues did a lot to integrate these perspectives on gender on several conferences and papers. It took very long to have the first keynote on gender. It was held on the last Amsterdam conference this spring by Giselinde Kuipers. Why? Can theories on established and outsiders help in this case? Could this be a typical but gendered drag effect of habits? Sure, I would assume. And moreover, even the idea of generational change, transformation, and others can help here to explain academic habits and traditions against innovative gender, intersectional, or diversity studies in process theory. Or has the fantasy prevailed that gender would be automatically integrated within socialist revolution like Marx did, or within functional democratization? We can also ask whether this is a long-term effect of male fantasies of more or less great men like Knigge, for example. With much blame, he assumes that women in science would cause not only disgust, but compassion if these poor beings dare to discuss the most important things which during all the centuries have been a result of troublesome research by great men. Maybe, well, dear genders, times have changed, and meanwhile we did it. On this international conference, it is outstanding that we even have 3 keynotes by women. However, not only is a small footnote in Elias' chapter on shame and repugnance that I've chosen as our motto here must have been overlooked for a long time, but also the whole field of process sociology of gender relations studied in long-term historical perspective. What I want to present you today is a brief overview on the international enrichment of process theory focusing on gender with the following agenda. Gender and the agenda. The connection between gender and the power relations has been addressed in many variants of gender and women's studies. It's important at this point to differentiate between women's studies as the first older generational or scientific tradition growing up in the 70s, and the newest developments called gender, because it's a relation between the genders that's of interest. Feminist philosophers have shed light on various aspects of gender identity formation. Think of de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, Kristeva, Ben Habib, or others. They stressed the performative effect of social structures and norms, the contingency of gender-based domination, and the need of empowerment of the weaker and minorities by way of social critique. However, the unique feature of Elysian theory has taken long to find its way into gender studies. With the work of Elias, Cas Wouters, Christine Brinkgreve, Ali de Reekt, myself, if I may say so, and several other colleagues, figurational research about gender relations has increased since the late 1980s and grown into a subfield. But gender balances and imbalances still remain a secondary subject. On the one hand, it was in line with the general penchant of the so-called second wave of historical sociology. On the other, to analyze gender relations in their progressive and also regressive mutability as a product of interdependent long-term developments of society is relatively seldom in sociology. So Elias' figurational and process theory, with its relational concept of power, offers not only valuable contributions to explicate the dimension of the sociology of gender implicit in it. I come to my Second point, process sociology and the reception in women's studies. We go back to nearly around about the 70s. Although widely received in the circle of classical sociological texts, Elias' book on the process of civilization and related figurational concepts such as the power balance or his take on game models were only hesitantly adopted by women's studies. This long-lasting reception barrier to figuration theory is more than a mere taste barrier directed against the sound of Elias' text, Annette Tribal states. Early women's studies in particular, and to some extent also current gender studies, had or still have difficulties with Elias' relational thinking. This is actually surprising because both his gender sociological approach and the figurational concept of power balances, can bring in ideal authors for gender theory tribal continues. Early feminist studies, flashlights. Early feminist studies since the 1980s, with their traditional critique of the state, violence, and power, at least focused on the blind spots of process theory. Klein and Liebsch from Hamburg stated that in contrast, today's focus of some deconstructive gender studies reveals a peculiar indifference towards process and civilization theory. This could be understood best in view of Elias' own knowledge sociological framework. Elias' relational idea was not particularly attractive for the first or second generation of women researchers who struggled for autonomy and even recognition in academic life. Moreover, they still have to fight for control over their lives, participation, and rights concerning abortion, divorce, or equal pay. In addition, the gradual nuances and interactions in the process of civilization, next to the spurts and regressions of power between the sexes, had easily been overlooked at that time. Like other theories, figurational and process sociological theory has been accused of ignoring patriarchal, structural violence against women and other things. Although Elias' approach of decivilizing behavior and male habitus during the Nazi dictatorship found sporadic approval in early women's studies, especially in Germany, was considered gender blind. One critique stated that Elias only described the different phenomenology of male behavior insofar that acts of war appear almost exclusively as male actions, Gravenhorst criticized. Therefore, Elias, she continues, overlooked both female complicity and the failed civilization of man. Other authors of that time missed a focus on women from the lower classes, or that Elias falls short in saying social relations are permanently balanced. In this context, also Christine Brinkgreve stresses that although men and women are mutually dependent, does not mean that power relations between them are in state of balance. However, a closer look at Elias' oeuvre reveals a more differentiated discussion of gender relations in his writings. I come to the third point. A figurational topical examination of Elias' figurational and process sociological approach against the background of gender relations initially took place in the scholarly vicinity of Elias' students. A supposedly essentialist style in Elias' binary gender construction was eventually identified in the course of contemporary deconstructing debates. Whether it is the changing relations in urban working class from Ali Direct, the knowledge and power in the academic establishment, and access of women to social elites, or rugby sport from Katie Liston, equality policies in relationships and organizations, or marriage and family in the civilizing process, that was my master degree, as well as the gender and leadership positions, the range of international process and figurational theoretical gender research has developed enormously in the last decades. I made a visualization without guarantee, please. I realize now that I also forget from Italy, Adele Bianco, for example, who is on the screen here. So this is only an overview about the important impact in this area. And in Germany, for example, the historian Hausen introduced the concept of gender character to analyze essentialized polarity of men's and women's worlds in the development of bourgeois society. She made use of Elias also, as well like Ute Frevert, who implicitly works with Elysian ideas, reconstructing historical and modern gender differences also in view of its affective elements. Moreover, especially Cas Wouters' work with Sex and Manners draws primarily on the analysis of figurative ideals and informalization theory applied on the process of civilization to examine female emancipation in the West. Especially early Dutch studies on gender relations have been undertaken, for example, in women's health by Rineke van Daan, and on partnership, income and working life, and family ideals or homosexuality. And this is a connection to queer or diversity studies. Polish and French researchers apply figurational studies to the control of the female body, present here, for example, by abortion policy, birth, or beauty ideals. Controversial issues such as Me Too and sexism imply a double-bind effect that is remarkable in terms of knowledge in sociology, Florence Delmotte stated. The transformation of sexual impulses and the related development of shame and embarrassment are currently particularly explosive topics as well. This brings us to the next important aspect, power. Norbert Elias meets gender studies. The common theme of gender-oriented process sociology approaches consists in exploring relations or independencies between the sexes, including the perspective of power and power balances. Process-oriented approaches investigate how these power balances are particularly pronounced in certain social processes and contexts. Klein and Lieb stated. In this context, for a socio-historical perspective, power is not set absolutely. It's also not just a medium that operates in a political system as system theories assume. Rather, it can be seen as a structural peculiarity of all human and thus public as well as private relationships that are changeable. And this is the most important thing in this power concept. Because according to Elias, those who are supposedly superior in power also depend on those who are inferior in power, resulting in a double bind between individuals and social groups. You know, all this, I don't have to quote it in that length, but we depend on others, others depend on us. And so far as we are more dependent on others, then they are on us, more directed by others than they are on us. They have power over us, and so on. The gradual transformation of closed-meshed external constraints into self-constraints mentioned in the process of civilization is not linear, but thereby accompanied by numerous spurts and regressions. This points to the fact that under the surface of civilized behavior, intrusions are possible at any time. In differentiated societies, the external control not only demands that every individual adapts his or her behavior precisely to the necessities of this network. Moreover, Elias states, if the strain of such constant self-control becomes too much for an individual, this is enough to put him or her and others in mortal danger. Therefore, this approach can not only contribute to making the desideratum of a power theory of the sexes more concrete tribal states, the specific orientation of gender relations can be understood even more as a specific product of civilizational development. Power as a structural characteristic of social relationships can preferably be transferred to gender relations. It expresses itself in a variety of ways, and it's not statically attributed to just one side or the other. So, on the one side, or on the one hand, the gender struggle differs from other conflict, as women's struggle for social equality had started from a relatively outsider position, being excluded or marginalized from central resources of power. On the other hand, men and women are very dependent on each other as individuals as well as social groups. Throughout his work, Elias consistently stated that gender relations are dynamic, standing for the microcosmos of social figurations in general. The concept of andrarchy, introduced by him as a counter-concept of the idea of patriarchy, was intended to capture the traditional male dominance and also to name it in its changeability. Unfortunately, this proposal could not prevail in the gender debate, Klein found out. Elias himself, on the other hand, was not only impressed by the feminist debates, especially in Amsterdam. Moreover, in relation to other sociological classics, he very early reflected that at first instance, a long-term perspective is needed to analyze the civilizational history of family and gender. Elias mostly described the direction of gender relations as a process of decreasing power inequalities in favor of women and as a wider egalization. Exceptions in this context are selected footnotes in the Marbach archives with well-known paper on marriage and several forewords and passages in the collected works. Elias' prominent essay, The Change in Balance of Power Between the Sexes, is one of the few original writings in which he addresses gender dynamics directly. Here, on the basis of the ancient Roman state, I think you all should know this text. He states that at least in the long run, the normative diction of physical dominance ideally is weakening and the principle of negotiation between the sexes is increasing. Different spheres of power are thus differentiated so that the chains mediating between the legal system and the power structure have today grown longer in keeping with the greater complexity of society. So the different civilization curves of the sexes are not characterized by gradual degradation or progress, but by a peculiar more or less. Another theme of this essay is the connection of violence against women and the laws that enforce it. Just to give a short quote, you may know that in Roman society, especially unmarried women, from early days onward were passive objects of a violent act or of a transaction between males of different kin groups and so on. Okay, times have changed. Over time and by changes in law, women became more equal in marriage and relationships in general, and thereby society reached over the generations a higher, thoroughly constructive basis, not only for the history. Oh, I mixed it. Sorry. Over the generations, a higher level of civilization, Elias continues. It is therefore not surprising that Elias also revisits gender relations and their inherent hierarchies in further essays, albeit sporadically. For example, in his writings on Some Remarks on the Problems of Work, he refers to work as the main ranking mechanism of people in modern societies. He also gives the topos a gendered but stereotyped dimension, illustrating the dependency of women on working spouses, especially in sole breadwinner scenarios, when he states, okay. Oh, sorry, I missed it. Ah, yeah, here is it. People's job, or in some cases, at least the occupational work done by the male part of the population in our type of society to a large extent determines the position of a person or family in the status hierarchy. The progressive process of civilization between the sexes is also evident in the way people treat each other in both public and private spaces. Especially aspects of enacting human sexuality were gradually moved from the public to the private sphere. Here too, Elias observes a processual course of action, talking about an unarticulated shame among adults concerning their own sexuality. But not only acts of sexual nature, but also ordinary everyday practices and actions cannot escape the hierarchization of gender and gender-specific policies and perceptions. In this context, the following example from my own research shows how a fatal and fantasy-driven transfiguration of gender relations can be. You all know, I think, social anthropologist Steven Pinker. He's severely convinced that women figure as the better angels of our nature, representing his cliché on female peacefulness. In completely ignoring gender studies, he has a fantasy that, together with self-control and societal connectedness, a third ideal came under attack: marriage and family life, which had done so much to domesticate male violence in the preceding decades. And that's my point. So although at first impression, this remark seems a bit convincing, a more detached approach shows its narrowness. Firstly, for centuries, it was almost women, married women, who had to pay the price with extreme self-control and subordination in marriage and public life, as a very precondition of the male civilization process. Secondly, life for educated and non-educated men and women differed in many ways, as not everybody had the right to marry. Thirdly, constructing women as the peaceful angels of civilization neglects her story with its ups and downs of increasing and decreasing power changes. And last but not least, this construction completely ignores diverse forms of sexual orientation that took place outside of the marriage unit. Contrary to Pinker's ahistorical and essentializing view, modern gender research shows that in her story, there existed female armies, for example, of the Dahomey in Benin. Moreover, gender relations have become flexible throughout the last 40 years, and traditional patriarchal gender orders have been eroded. In short, coming back to Elias, he makes clear, albeit in scattered places, that a particular problem of gender inequality not only had and often still has a strong one-sided focus, but was long overlooked. However, it is both a misconception that power is only ever experienced one-sidedly as superior or inferior, and also that human beings can live like a homoclausus isolated from social structures. For him, the battle of the sexes is different, but says what we witness today is quite decidedly a phase in a long drawn out power struggle between two different social groups, which has some similarity with other power struggles between social groups within a state. And then he says, I skip a bit, in common with many other power struggles, this is a struggle for greater social equality between groups, one of which women has in many respects had an outsider position. Its members traditionally have been excluded from many social positions monopolized by the other group. With Elias' concept of people and the dynamics of social figurations, neither a naturalized, civilized female ego in opposition to the male ego, nor a uniform form of civilization to the female ego can be found, Klein and Lieb stated 1997. Rather, the universal sociality of human beings shows that the naturalization of dual genders analogous to the rationalization of behavior can be read as a specific stage and civilizational sub-process. Klein and Lieb continue. It becomes clear that the process book and the figurational approach is thus widely recognized and used as a thoroughly constructive basis, not only for the history of the civilization of the female ego that was the conference name in Hamburg 1995. Since until the 1990s, neither Elias nor women's and gender studies systematically addressed the interwoven genesis of the interdependent gender orders and gender differentiating forms of civilization, there is still a need for further research here. In summary, Elias' texts remain ambivalent and sometimes also follow stereotypical ideas and fantasies, maybe. It is true, for example, that neither an utter subjection of women in the early days is assumed any more than a linear civilization. Nevertheless, the allegation gender would only become a significant aspect for Elias when the balance of power between women and men changes in the direction of an increase in the social power of women, as Klein and others criticized, stands for the next phase of the debate and still remains to be checked. And also before, in his chapter on shame and repugnance, for example, he stated that the transformation of sexual impulses and an advance of shame feelings in the relations of men and women further remains to be shown. Here, the Dutch figurationalists were the first, in my view, to pick up the baton most impressively. We could pick it up to bring more light into the blind game of gender interdependencies between shifts towards growing equality and stubborn inequalities. So to sum up and move on, power resources have become more complex in the course of gender history. They range from physical and economical as well as emotional and social resources, and last not least, up to legal and symbolic arrangements between the sexes. How can one therefore apply figurational analysis in long, middle, and even short-term perspectives? I want to remind the audience of the current methodological debate and process in figurational studies we started 10 years ago. One example from the management and gender discourse helps to illustrate this. We can, for example, understand organizations as powerful figurations with its own order, positions, and rules that cause interpersonal tensions and conflicts. Organizations are also embedded in so-called gendered environment or gender cultures with a specific formalization and informalization span. For example, in Western societies, during long-term developments of functional democratization and persistent fights, women and a few men from the bourgeoisie, middle class, and working classes successfully have fought for social participation and equal opportunities in education, politics, and the economy. Although all women benefited from the formal increase in power, they profited from it differently in diverse social milieus and strata. In socio and psychogenetic terms, this was accompanied by a socio-political loosening of formerly strict standards of behavior between the sexes and social groups, which Cas Wouters described in Informalization. An increase in gender inequality is also reflected in a change of the legal practice, which has helped to formalize social conventions. This provided disadvantaged groups with appropriate instruments that should not be underestimated. However, it is precisely the effective benefit of company equality and anti-discrimination law that has been attacked for some years. The occupation of top position is constantly the focus of attention because, for example, in Germany, they are still up to 90% male, in many cases also white male top position members. If women get to the top, they tend to remain on the second management level. This gender leadership gap is particularly eye-catching in companies with more than 500 employees. In this respect, as it often is the case with marginalized employees, they're under the multiple pressure of expectations, fantasies, proof and overperform. According to studies on women in supervisory boards, this matter of facts not only puts them at the risk of failure, but also that of wearing out their labor. Whereas not seldom unsuccessful men, meanwhile, move on to the next challenge almost without harm, women tend to withdraw from business. Moreover, they may be subject to emotional alienation due to persistent conflicts and dissonances, Rastetter find out in her micropolitical analysis. Thus, formalization in the sense of codifying organizational culture and structural norms and rules remains ambivalent, because on the one hand, there are equalizing effects insofar as it overcomes exclusionary practices. Otherwise, it can also have counterintuitive effects when its function as a legitimation facade between which arbitrary or stereotypical patterns and fantasies are perpetuating. I come to my last point, the perspectives. Against this very briefly outlined background, it becomes clear, I hope, that many colleagues from all over the world have long been using allies' insights and concepts to explore gender relations. Their innovative work, with a few significant exceptions, has not yet been published in a collection. Therefore, it is a task long overdue, not only in terms of trajectories of sociological theorizing, but also in terms of the economy of academic knowledge production to assemble gender and process sociological research. Thus, there is the need to demonstrate its polyvalence, its diversity, and its explanatory power. Being interwoven in the academic circles until today, there's reason enough not only to give a keynote, but also a book on gender and process theory. Still, until today was one missing link, I think. Here we go. Having been latently smoldering with this enterprise, the idea conceive a volume emerged at the latest conference at the German Historical Institute in Paris in January this year. We and several colleagues expressed the mutual need to finally focus on the gender-related research done with a figurational approach. I asked Valerie Dahl, I asked Marta Buchholz to do so, and we decided to go for it during the Amsterdam conference this March. It was in many ways symbolic that it was the first Norbert Elias Foundation conference in many years, including a separate session dedicated to gender relation. It picked up over more than a quarter of a century to the 1995 conference in Hamburg about civilization of the female ego to go in with it. Moreover, it was also a continuation of the intensive Amsterdam activities of Cas Wouters and Bram van Stolk, Christine Brinkgreve, Rieneke van Dalen, and Ali Direct, who passed away last October. She not only wrote about gender relations in urban working class families and how the industrialization transformed men in wage earners and women in housewives, but also about material interdependencies and the nowadays difficulties to combine this with the effective ideal of family relations in geld and gezien, money and family. From one perspective, our book on dynamics of gender relations, that's the title, will recapitulate gender-related texts written or inspired by Norbert Elias, starting with early works that he supervised in his Frankfurt times, like those of Ilse Seekloff or Nathalie Halperin. This book presents for the first time in English the entire oeuvre of extensive archival research over many years in many private collections, as well as in the Elias estate of the German Literature Archive in Marbach. This historical part shows that the origin of the figurational sociology of gender, shedding light on its genesis and early thematical array. Moreover, the collection documents further development of the research with a focus on the present time, in which gender often seems to be relativized as but more than a human category of social cultural differentiation. Areas of the research are gender and work and organizational life, body and soul, violence and law, private and public spaces, and so on. Moreover, the relational and comparative analysis of the dynamic socio- and psychogenesis of human gender orders can thus close a long overdue research gap. Referring to the conference topic, we can ask whether it is still difficult to uphold calm and realistic understanding of the gendered society in which we live. Are we being submerged under a tidal wave of emotionally driven fantasies, such as men would lose the gender conflict? In addition, these complex and emotionally charged movement discourses are frequently attacked across the board by a masculinist, anti-genderist movement. In a perfidious way, it uses gender reflexive language, for example, gender political initiative, in order to oppose a pretended preference for women and minorities in all areas of society and to agitate the public opinion. They, for example, proclaim, in contrast to the scientifically proven fact that the gender income gap results from purely private preferences and gender-specific life plans. Moreover, these anti-feminist activists severely believe that there is a gender empathy gap at the expense of supposedly neglected men, because the unilateral promotion of women has been accompanied by devaluation of men. The consequences of this ideological feminism has so far remained predominantly a taboo subject in the public sphere. So as you may have seen, I hope, many more reasons to explicitly show the immense importance of the gender, of the category gender, because whether deconstructed or not, gender still matters in the working world, in family life, in education, in politics, in laws, and many places else. Thank you very much for your attention.